Hilchos Bechoros Perek Shishi, the laws of the firstborn, chapter 6. Boker Tov, Shavua Tov, back to regular life. All those weeks, one chag after another, it's behind us now. Now it's on to regular life. And yet, Rambam continues every day, so here we are. Today begins really a new section within this set of laws. We're finished with the laws of Bechor, of the firstborn animal. Now we're moving on to Meiser Behema, the animal tithe. The Rambam told us that included in this set of laws, because the Torah puts them together, so he's also going to put them together. The special yearly procedure, the yearly ceremony where a person would take all of his animals that were born that year into a pen, release them one by one, and the 10th one was to be offered as a sacrifice. And for the next 3 days, we're going to be learning about all the parameters and the guidelines and the halachas that apply related to this animal. Today, we're not so much focused on the process of how to separate the animals, but more the core of the obligation itself. Who is obligated? When are we obligated? What kind of animals are obligated? As we're going to see throughout the chapter. The Rambam begins halacha aleph mitzvah saseh. It's a positive commandment. Lahafrish echad me'asara mikol behemes toheres sheyivoldu la'adam b'chol shana v'shana. To separate, to put aside, one of every 10 of the kosher domesticated animals that are born to a person every year. And specifically, which kosher animals are we referring to? This mitzvah only applies to cattle and sheep. That's it. Shenemar, because the verse which describes the obligation, it says, V'chol masar bakar v'tzayin, all tithes of the cattle and the sheep. So only those two animals are the ones to which this mitzvah applies. Halacha beis, meiser behema. This mitzvah of the animal tithe, only applies to animals that are unholy, not to animals that have already been consecrated to be a sacrifice. It applies in Israel and in the diaspora, while the temple is standing and while it's not standing. However, that is only the biblical law. The sages forbade us from doing the animal tithe nowadays, and they established an enactment that we only do the tithe in the presence of the Holy Temple. Why? Gzeira, this was a decree. Maybe a person is going to separate the animal tithe, and it's going to be unblemished, fit to be brought as a sacrifice, and nevertheless the owner is going to eat it. Which would lead him to an excision prohibition, which would be slaughtering a holy animal outside the temple, because the Meiser Behema in its prime state has to be offered as a sacrifice. So if you're going to leave it unblemished and then eat it for dinner, you're going to basically have just violated a huge prohibition. So they said, you know what, just stay away from the whole thing. Don't do any tithing nowadays. If nevertheless you transgressed and you did the animal tithing nowadays, it is considered a tithe, and the halacha is you have to treat it as holy, wait till it gets a blemish, and then you could eat it. Halacha gimel, hakil chayavin b'meiser behema. All Jews are obligated in this mitzvah to separate a tithe of the animal. Kohanim, Levim, Yisraelim, doesn't matter if you're a Kohen or a Levite or a regular Israelite. Halacha dalid, what do you do with the animal? V'din meiser behema, the law of the tithe from the animals is that ideally it should be slaughtered in the temple courtyard. Then you sprinkle its blood, not in the usual way where you would splash it onto the corners of the mizbeach, rather you would simply pour it by the base of the mizbeach one time. And you offer certain parts of its insides on the altar. The rest of the meat needs to be eaten by the owners in Jerusalem, kishar kodshim kalon, like any other lighter level sacrifice. Ve'ein lakohanim b'klum, the kohanim get no rights to it. Unlike the Bechor, which is all to the kohanim, the meiser is totally not to the kohanim. Ela kulay labailim kapesach, it's completely the possession of the owners, like the Passover sacrifice. The kohanim had no part in the sacrifice. V'imhaya balmum, but if it had a blemish, bein shanafal beimum, whether a blemish developed on it later, after it was tithed, bein sheifrisha betchila b'mum, or you had set it aside to begin with, and it was already blemished, it happened to be the 10th one that walked out of the pen. It had a blemish, there is no holiness to it, it can be eaten in any place. Halacha hey, there's an interesting law that applies to Meiser Behema. Meiser Behema asur lemachre kishehu tamim. It's forbidden to sell the animal tithe while it's unblemished. In other words, while it's potentially able to be offered as a sacrifice, you cannot sell it. Shenemar boy, because the Torah says about it, lo yigael, it shall not be redeemed. What does redeem mean? Mipi Ashmuel lamdu, we learn from tradition, shezeh shenemar lo yigael, when the Torah says don't redeem it, af isur mechira b'mashma, it also means, it also implies a prohibition against sale. She'ein nigal ve'ein nimkar klal, it cannot be sold or redeemed in any form. V'yirali, it seems to me, says the Rambam, so much so, she'amleicher meiser le'asa klum. If you do sell the meiser, you have done nothing. V'le'kana le'keach, the buyer doesn't even acquire it. And therefore there's no way you can get lashes for this prohibition, because it's impossible to do the prohibition. It's so strict that the sale is always considered invalidated. Just like somebody who sells things that were consecrated to the Kohanim, where the sale is just invalid. The buyer doesn't acquire it. Or like somebody who sells the Yefas Torah, the beautiful woman that is allowed to be captured in wartime, as will be explained in its place, actually at the very, very end of the Rambam, in the end of the 14th book, the Rambam discusses these laws. One of the laws of a Yefas Torah is that once you take her into the home, you cannot sell her. So much so that if you sell her, the sale is invalid. So you really can't transgress the prohibition. Halacha vav, midivrei seifrim, rabbinically they added to this. Not only should you not sell Meiser Behema while it's in its ideal state of not being blemished, but even more so, sha'asr lemachrei balmum. You also cannot sell it when it is blemished, va'afilu shachot, even after it's been slaughtered. Gzeir Hashem yimkerenu chai, for a decree lest you sell it while it's also alive. Lefichach, therefore, we go even further. Ein sheiklin mana keneged mana b'maiser. You cannot use a piece of meat to be a weight against another piece of meat if it's meiser behema kederech shesheiklin babcher, even though we could do that when it comes to b'cher, as we saw the other day in chapter 1. Because weighing meat against meat looks like a sale. And here, sale is completely forbidden, even blemished, even after death, so that is also included. This weighing process is also not allowed. One exception. If Meiser Behema belonged to orphans, and it was slaughtered because it got a blemish, you can sell it normally. The rabbis didn't decree in this case where we can get more money returned to the orphans. We want to enlarge the orphans' estate. We always want to protect orphans. So, there, Meiser Behema, you can sell. Halacha ches, Meiser Behema, shenishchat b'mumay. When you do slaughter Meiser Behema, because it got a blemish, mutar limkar chelbay v'gidav v'oirei v'atzmaisav. It is permitted to sell its fats, its sinews, its hide, and its bones. The only prohibition is to sell the actual flesh, the actual meat. Even more so, there's another loophole. V'im hivliya dmei habasar. If you swallowed the worth of the meat, bidmei ha'oyer v'hachela v'hagidin, in the worth of the hide and the fats and the sinews, and you sold it all in what's called havla, absorption or swallowing, mutar, that's permitted. What does that mean? That means, let's say the meat costs $100. The hide, sinews, and fats also cost $100. You tell the guy, I'm going to charge you $200 for the hide, sinews, and bones, and as a package deal, I'm going to include for you the meat. So you aren't directly selling the meat. The payment is all being made for the other items, the other entities, the other accessories. And you're just handing off the meat as well. It's called the havla, and that's allowed. If the worth of the bones was very expensive, and you absorbed the worth of the flesh only in the amount of the bones, not even the fats and the sinews, just the bones, were that expensive that it wouldn't look too questionable if you also included the meat for that same price, mutar is also permitted. Point is, as long as you didn't directly sell the meat, that's permitted. Everybody is believed when it comes to blemishes on a Meiser Behema, Leimar to say, that this blemish was imposed naturally and not by somebody's active consent. As we saw the other day when it comes to Bechoros, a person who actively makes a mum doesn't qualify it to be slaughtered. Same thing with Meiser Behema. So we have to ascertain if a mum was made naturally or actively. Everybody is believed to establish that it was done naturally. Even those who usually are not believed when it comes to Bechoros blemishes, they are believed when it comes to Meiser Behema because there's nothing to gain. A person, in addition, can also examine his own Meiser Behema. When it comes to Bechoros, the expert who examines the Bechoros for a blemish cannot examine his own Bechoros. But Meiser, you could examine your own Meiser, and you can allow it to be eaten if you were an expert, because technically speaking, if the guy wanted, he can blemish all of his animals before doing the whole tithing process, and the tithing process to begin with will yield a blemished animal. Which would mean that the meiser will be blemished from its beginning, from the outset. So since you can do it anyways, the fact that now it didn't have a blemish and we see a new blemish, we're going to believe you to judge your own animal and say whether it's a blemish that qualifies or not. Halacha Yud, meiser behemas, we're going to see, only applies to things that you owned. However, halekeach tloim shenoldu b'shana zu, if you buy sheep that were born this year, or they were given to you as a gift, they are exempt from tithing until they're born in your possession. Only animals born in your possession this year are what you have to tithe from. If they entered your possession in any other way, you're exempt. And this leads to a very interesting law about partners. Lefichach, therefore, hashutfin shenishtatfu bebehemis. Partners partnered up with animals. Okay. The pictures aren't exactly what I wanted over here, but let's try to use this just to imagine the case. They partnered up with animals. Each partner brings in 100 sheep into the flock. And they mix them up and they now become partners. Each one equally owns every animal. All 200 animals now are going to be exempt from being tithed. Because every individual sheep has been sold effectively to the other partner as well. So too, if you have brothers who inherited an estate from their father, including sheep, even if those sheep were born that year, they're all exempt from tithing because now they're owned jointly by two people. It's as though it's been sold to each of the brothers. But any animals that are born into the partnership after they become partners, even from these animals in which they partnered, whether to the partners or to the brothers, they're liable to be tithed. Because there's no exemption for partners or for brothers. But the animals have to be born within the ownership of the partners or the brothers. If they came before and then they were split among the partners, now it's like sold and the exemption devolves. But if they're born in the possession of the partners or the brothers, then they're obligated. Same thing if it wasn't sheep, it was money. They were partners in actual cash. They bought money with the money, they bought animals with the partnership money. Or if brothers bought animals from the money of the estate. Any new animals born following this purchase are obligated to be tithed. They're born into their possession, and at this point, the brothers and the partners are like one entity. If the brothers and the partners, after these new animals were born, now split up, they dissolved the partnership, or they split up the estate, when they re-partnered up, all the new animals are now also exempt from being tithed. The moment they dissolved the partnership, everything becomes purchased. And whatever is purchased is exempt. When they re-partnered up, they're now re-partnering up in these animals for the first time. And nothing new was born into the new partnership, the second partnership. Even if the original dissolving was done in a very even way, they split goats, sheep opposite sheep, and every group of 10 was divided equally. It's all considered exempt from tithing. It's all like it's bought. Even if you clearly marked the division and then brought it right back to the original state, it doesn't make a difference. Brothers and partners who jointly have money and animals. They're in the middle of dissolving the partnership, or they're in the middle of splitting up the estate. They only had a chance to divide the money, but not the animals. Chayavin b'maiser, they're still liable in tithing their animals. Because the animals have not become purchased yet, they're still jointly owned. But once they divide the animals, even if they haven't yet divided the cash, and they're already exempt, because at this point of the dividing of the animals have become purchased one from another, and they're exempt. If somebody buys 10 fetuses that are right now in the stomach of their moms, but when they're going to be born this year, they're going to be born into his possession. They will all have to go into the pen to be tithed once they're born, because they're born already in his possession. You didn't buy them already born. They're born, owned by you. Yud Gimel Kohen Shenaflu Lo Eser Behemais Begezel Hager. If a Kohen gets 10 animals from what's called Gezel Hager. Gezel Hager means a convert to Judaism really has no relatives, because all of his blood relatives are not considered related to him. Let's say he dies without children or without a marriage. His estate now belongs to who? It's ownerless. But the Torah says it belongs to the Kohanim. So the Kohen wakes up one day and he finds out he just got 10 new animals from Gezel Hager. A convert died and the estate went to him. Pturim min ha-meiser, they are exempt from the tithe. Shematnes kahun namatanesin, because the gifts, the Kohanic gifts, including this one, are real gifts. And we just explained that if you give a gift, transferring the ownership, it's exempt. It has to be born in your possession. When you put everything into the pen, getting them ready for the tithing, all animals go in. Whether they're unblemished, whether they're blemished, even if they're things which cannot be offered on the altar. Doesn't matter, you bring them all in. Except for a hybrid, the hatrefa, or a mortally wounded animal, the yotzei or a C-section animal, or mechusar zman, or an animal in its first 7 days of life, it cannot be offered yet as a sacrifice. Shekol elu pturim min ha-meiser, because all these are exempt from being tithed, they don't even go into the pen. Also, there's an orphan animal whose mom died, or was slaughtered when he was born, he also doesn't go into the pen to be tithed. All of these last couple of details were learned from tradition. They're not explicit in the Torah, but they were all derived by the sages. Tesvav, ena lekeach patur. We said before that a buyer is exempt, but a buyer is really only exempt only if the animal was purchased after it's old enough to be tithed, which we just said is 8 days old. Therefore, if somebody buys sheep in the first 7 days since their birth, when their time comes, the end of the year, which we'll explain in the next 2 days, you have to tie them. Because since the animal in that state, when it's mechusar zman, in the first 7 days, since it's not fit to be tithed, it's just like buying fetuses, and the fetus is being born into your possession. What if you have an animal, it's a doubt. You don't know if it goes into one of these categories, and so does it have to be tithed or not? It's exempt from being tithed. You can just err on the side of leniency. Take them out. Therefore, if you have a whole group of sheep, and one of them walks in that happens to be an orphan or a purchased animal, and now you don't know which one it is, the entire flock now is exempt from being tithed, because each one is a doubt, maybe that's the one that's exempt from being tithed. And so, you go to the side of leniency, and all of them are exempted.